welcome to our next podcast on sustainability and resilience. And we have a very, very interesting guest. It's been long waiting. We've been trying to get Santosh on this call for a long, long time. Santosh is actually a fellow at Center for Policy Research. He's been working on issues of air pollution and many other environmental issues for many, many years. He's been writing on these issues and also been influencing policy in some way or the other. Only if you think that perhaps writing and speaking in public influences policy, that's another matter. That the role of people like Santosh and myself and many other people, that does it actually affect our policy. But just to tell you that a lot of conversation and a lot of scientific and data-driven conversation is what Santosh has been driving for several years now vis-a-vis air pollution. So Santosh, thanks a lot for agreeing to participate in this conversation today.
It's completely my pleasure, Vimlendu. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So, Santosh, what we'll do is that, of course, everyone knows about air pollution. Everyone experiences air pollution, and therefore it's not something which is new. And we all wake up a few months every year to talk about it. And then, of course, go back to our slumber. And this applies to citizens as well as to our government as well. That smoggy days, we think the air is bad. And on other days, there might not be any smog. And we think air pollution is gone. Just for our viewers, if you could just tell us what causes the air pollution right now in northern India specifically. If you could, there's a lot of confusion around whether it's the old vehicles, whether it's the thermal power plants, it's construction demolition dust. Scientifically, data point of view, what are the main sources of air pollution that we actually have in northern India?
Yeah, so I think one of the main issues with air pollution is the sheer number of different sources that are important, right? And so in principle, the relative contributions of these different sources varies from location, varies often by season as well. So the sources of air pollution during the summer could be very different from those in the winter. And this, I think, definitely contributes to this lack of confusion. So especially among interest groups, I feel like everybody has their specific source apportionment study that sort of points to somebody else being the problem. But I think it can be broadly thought of in terms of sources as a 4 or 5-fold problem. You have industries and power plants, so sort of your conventional emission sources. You have vehicles of various kinds, and in particular, large commercial vehicles play a disproportionate role, something that often gets neglected, I think. You have waste burning, which could be of different kinds. You have commercial and road dust, as you mentioned, so construction and road dust. And then you have household sources. So maybe I could start with the last of these, because rather counterintuitively, it is the single largest source of air pollution exposure, outdoor air pollution exposure in the country, right? And so by household sources, we basically mean the millions of households that burn solid fuels for cooking, for water heating, for space heating during the winters. And while any individual household doesn't necessarily add up, doesn't really contribute to very much, all of them together, it's the single largest source. This is in addition to a very high exposure indoors, because it's often burnt indoors, right? So yeah, we actually have unusually a consensus in the literature that this is the single largest source. Your point sources, industries, power plants are sort of next. And especially in cities, in places like Delhi, transport ends up playing a fairly large role. So in some ways, all of these are important. And to be able to get anywhere, we need to be able to tackle all of them in parallel, which obviously makes it that much more challenging.
Okay. So, as you said, that there are all these sources, and there have been several studies, again, as you rightly said, that an IIT Kanpur report will say something else, and IIT Kharagpur will say something else. And it also depends on who is commissioning that study in that sense. A lot of times research, unfortunately, is not what lies on the ground, but who's actually commissioning that study in that sense, at what sometimes there's a political agenda behind the findings of a study as well. But, in the last couple of years, we've actually seen certain reports talking about that situation is actually improved when it comes to issues of air pollution. And especially in Delhi, we've seen the local government claim that air pollution levels have gone down by around 25%, 30%, 40%. And we all know that there has been some drastic change or shift, as in the peripheral highway that we're talking about, or the fuel that the industries use. What's your understanding? Is situation better than yesteryears right now?
So compared to, let's say, a couple of decades back, we can be pretty sure that air pollution levels are certainly higher, not just in Delhi, but really everywhere across the country. In fact, they become higher in places like Odisha and Chhattisgarh and so on, presumably because of new power plants and mining activities and so forth. But just compared to the last few years, I think there is a bit of a consensus now developing that, look, there's actually some improvement that we are witnessing. It's not necessarily enormous. It's by no means close to where we need to be. It's probably not the 25% number either, because that particular number was quite problematic. But there are improvements. It'd be hard to deny them. Why these improvements have happened, honestly, I don't know if we can say for sure. Not yet. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a reason to be cautiously optimistic here, that we're actually witnessing small improvements in air quality. We of course need to sustain it. These improvements are not happening anywhere close to the rate that we would want to be seeing. But yeah, I mean, fingers crossed, and hopefully we'll also be able to put our finger on, what exactly it is that seems to be working.
And is it, when we talk about this improvement, is it number of good air days increasing in a year, or are we talking about the AQI levels are not as bad as it used to be?
So I think there is a modest improvement in annual averages, which I think is one very reliable way of tracking this, because there are lots of seasonal changes. There is sort of a change in the mix. So in a place like Delhi, for example, the fraction of the year that falls in this poor or worse AQI levels, that has shrunk a little bit. And I think that's that's quite positive.
Okay, and a lot of times when we talk about air pollution and also air pollution conversation in public, a lot of episodic sources of pollution are widely discussed. As every time we talk about air pollution in news, it's about stubble burning, or is it about firecrackers? Now we know that we are in that season, that springtime right now, when farmer protests and issues of farm laws and everything else is being discussed, and stubble burning is also one of the things actually being discussed there. What do you think? How bad is stubble burning and its contribution to the ambient air quality of North India?
So this is one of those two-handed answers. On the one hand, stubble burning is certainly an important episodic source, right? So between mid-October to mid-November or so, it is unquestionably an important source in Delhi and NCR, and in some ways in the Indo-Gangetic belt more generally. So those numbers that you see from Safar, etc., that there are days when it could contribute as much as 40%, 50% of the, that seems to be now sort of the consensus. So on certain days, it's a huge contributor. The contribution even during this period can change quite a bit. So there are days when it is like 5%, 6%. So is it an important source during that time? Yes. Does it get disproportionate attention? Yes. The trouble is we seem to focus on air pollution as a crisis only when it is so obviously perceptible, right? So during those 2-3 weeks, everybody's talking about air pollution. There's a natural question as to what is causing this. Then the fingers are naturally pointed towards stubble burning. And I think we really need to break out of that. All said and done, like the discourse has certainly improved over the last few years. There is a greater appreciation that this isn't a winter specific problem alone, or this isn't a Delhi specific problem alone, but just, I think the national capital, the amount of media attention that Delhi gets, all of this sort of comes together to sort of anchor the problem of air pollution in, that very specific manifestation of it being this episodic high, which leads to all of these other issues like stubble burning getting a disproportionate.
Absolutely right, Santosh. So, when we talk about stubble burning, a lot of, we, throughout the year, a lot of conversation around air pollution, 80% of that would be around stubble burning. So a common man or a woman understands air pollution as somebody else's problem. And that's what the government also tries to tell us. As if you look at the public advertisements around air pollution in Delhi, I think 99% of them were about stubble burning and not about your own hotspots here. So we always also need to understand that if Anand Vihar has a 900 AQI, and if India Gate has 500 AQI, on the same day when, say stubble burning is happening, that means that there are hyper local reasons of pollution as well, which completely get ignored in that sense. So it becomes a political convenience a lot of times to blame the other than to look at your own sources of pollution in that sense. Now, of course, as in, when the stubble burning was being debated in the courts, of course, there was a petition by some youngsters, and of course, a bunch of petitions in the Supreme Court. There's been this new body that's been formed, as if we did not have so many bodies already. What do you think? As in, I know that I sometimes sound more cynical than you are. You're more optimistic than I am in that sense. How do you look at this new body? I don't even know what it's called right now.
So the new body is called the Commission on Air Quality Management in NCR and Adjoining Areas, CAQM-NCRAA. So look, I mean, I think we need to separate two things out, right? So first of all, there's the process by which this particular commission was created, right? It was created through a presidential ordinance. The ordinance itself, seems to have been drafted almost overnight. It took all of us by surprise. There was no kind of public consultation. Here was an opportunity to potentially create sort of a broader framework on how airshed management, would function. Here was an opportunity to potentially take a relook at the Air Act and some of the limiting clauses it has, and try and figure out what we can do to amend it to provide more teeth and flexibility to our regulators and so forth. All of that was sort of neglected, right? And so you had this ordinance that once again tackled or sought to tackle air pollution in the national capital region alone, ignoring the rest of the country. I think the complete absence of transparency and public input certainly, is a cause for concern as to how an agency created with this kind of opacity will potentially be somehow magically more transparent than the agencies we've had, right? On the positive side, though, because I mean, I do think I'm a little optimistic by nature. It's possibly a way to survive, but it is an important milestone, and I say this for the following reasons. One, it does ultimately explicitly recognize the need to manage air quality at the airshed level. This is essential for NCR. I don't think there's two ways to this. We have had, especially in this region, an issue with fragmented governance, right? So you have multiple state governments, you have the center and the Delhi governments sometimes being at loggerheads, often in fact being at loggerheads. In addition, you have municipal corporations. So the fragmented governance structure also essentially created an opportunity for a lack of accountability. You could never hold anybody to blame because seemingly everybody was to be blamed, right? And that's what happens every winter. You have each government blaming some other government. So one of the things with this commission is that there is a clause on overriding powers that makes it very clear that the buck stops at the commission. It has, not only does it have a jurisdiction over this entire area, it could potentially override the pollution control board of some other state or the municipal corporation of some other state. It could potentially override the central pollution control board, right? Clearly the buck stops with this commission,
Okay.
which I think is useful. Finally, the executive has sort of been shirking responsibility over the years. Typically, anything happens only when the courts take notice and then wrap somebody's wrist, and only then, do we sort of does the sort of government sort of grudgingly do anything. Here, one could argue that the executive has in some ways taken more responsibility. So if anybody is going to be blamed, it's going to be them.
Okay, so those are very positive things to state, but weren't those the main reasons why EPCA failed in many, many ways? As if you look at our learning from EPCA, has that been really taken into account in formulating this new committee? Because again, a very top-heavy senior joint secretary level people, at the end of the day, the regulation of air or air pollution or air polluting industries or institutions is to be done by the state pollution control boards or the lower executive. And there's nothing that we've actually talked about there. As at the end of the day, who is going to challan that polluting industry in Bhavana or that stubble burning farmer in Bhatinda? It can't be a joint secretary or a justice lokur going there and trying to catch someone burning stubble. So, and why I bring in EPCA here is that, that was another big elephant. We've seen that nobody was ever charge sheeted. As in, I think the conviction rate of EPCA was 0. It was almost an advisory body and formulating GRAP, and you can spell GRAP with any other using any other alphabet also. Where has it actually? What have you learned from EPCA?
So no, I think that's a great question, right? And EPCA is the exactly correct sort of agencies sort of compare the CAQM against. Have we learned anything at all from the nearly 2-decade experience with, more than the 2-decade experience actually with EPCA? One of the principal limitations, according to me, with the EPCA was that it had no full-time staff. It had no resources of its own, right? In theory, this new commission can have those things. They can have a cadre. They can have they're given a budget by the union government. They have full-time members also. So I think that is something that is that seems like an improvement on EPCA. You're exactly right.
How much budget has been allocated for this commission?
So this commission has been allocated a budget of 20 crores this year. And to be very honest, though, I have no idea whether that is adequate or not, because that brings the other question that you raised here in mind, right? We still don't know. It's been what, 3 months? We still don't quite know how this commission is going to function. So like you said, if an industry is non-compliant, what's the role of the commission? What's the role of the pollution control board? Does the commission take action? In theory, it can. Will it? We have no idea, right? And so there are still many questions on how exactly this particular commission is going to function. EPCA certainly had various powers that it did not use. In general, when we are thinking about institutions, we need to sort of distinguish between the powers that they have on paper to how they end up functioning because of various other constraints. Because each new agency is going to essentially not operate in a vacuum, but in an ecosystem where there are other agencies, where there are other competing sort of powers, right? And so with EPCA, what this meant was that at some point, it seemed like a decision had been taken that this would instead be primarily an advisory type of body, which is useful. I mean, there are lots of reports that EPCA put, which I think it doesn't get enough credit for. But was it a regulatory body? Most certainly not, right? And so yeah, it'll be interesting to see, whether CAQM will sort of take on sort of an EPCA role alone, or whether it'll actually expand it, use all these powers that has been given on paper. And yeah, I mean, very honestly, at this point, it's very hard to say. Are these 20 crores enough? Very hard to say.
Yeah. So EPCA also, in the sense, very empowered by the courts of our country. This new commission, again, as we saw how it actually unfolded while the hearing was going on, is where the government actually made a submission that they were actually thinking of a commission, and within, as you rightly said, overnight, suddenly just to give a response. We don't really know whether it was to make the courts happy or whether it was actually something that was planned, is where the commission came.
Yeah.
That brings me to the question of the role of judiciary in this entire air pollution governance. In last couple of years, we've actually seen courts play a very, very active role. And I'm of a mixed opinion that sometimes it's way too much on the part of our courts to actually indulge in issues of governance and issues of environmental governance, which is largely the role of the executive, which is actually solely the role of the executive in that sense, of course, plus, of course, civil society and the citizens in that sense. And I feel sometimes, and I wanted to ask you that, do courts help the cause of air pollution, or as some commentators say, that it actually damages the system, that you always look up to the court for an intervention and action, and not really the local government or the central government or Ministry of Environment and Forests? Look at most of these landmark reprimands or action points have actually come from the courts, but that's counterproductive. And the same court, in the same breath, one day will give you a good judgment and you'll feel, wow, courts are the saviors. But on the other day, they'll tell you that smog towers are the best thing that could have actually been born on this planet. And then you have to live with both, because judge is the last word on this. Judge knows everything.
Yeah. That's in fact, I mean, look, over the last 2-3 decades, starting, I think, from the mid 80s, the judiciary has played an enormously important role in pushing things along. And like you said, this has both its merits and demerits, right? On the one hand, it seemed like this was the only arm of the government that was actually being responsive, that for whatever reason, was taking this issue seriously, taking a whole range of issues on the environment seriously. On the other hand, though, the judiciary is really not equipped to sort of address some of these technical questions, which I think even the courts have sort of recognized at various points. Many of these committees, including EPCA, one of the objectives for creating it was to say, look, we really need to get this out of like the courtrooms, have sort of more deliberative forums with experts and so forth, to figure out like the nuts and bolts, instead of sort of us as judges figuring these out, which is fair. So yeah, I mean, I think partly the over reliance on the judiciary is because it has been difficult to be reliant on anybody else, and somehow because of the PILs, it was easier to like reach out to the courts for not grievance redressal but basically anything, instead of the environment department, instead of the MOFCC, instead of the CPCB. So yeah, I mean, I think we've been locked into that. I certainly don't think that that's sustainable, and certainly not. Look, all said and done, all these years of court intervention have still mostly focused on Delhi, right? If we need to be figuring out like the nuts and bolts of policy across the country, there's no way we can rely on the judiciary. I mean, that's too much, and it will lead to counterproductive outcomes from time to time. Smog towers, I think, is a great case in point. It's going to take it, as ridiculous as it is. It's going to be very, very hard to sort of get that particular measure out of sort of the heads of politicians and policymakers of various kinds. It's just too attractive a thing, like kuch nahi karna hai, you put that thing and somehow the problem magically goes away. Yeah.
So like many of us call it pseudoscience in that sense. A lot of times
it's not even pseudoscience. It is unscientific. Plain and simple. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read your piece in The Wire where you've analyzed this current budget. In fact, last couple of months, everyone has been talking about green start and green stimulus, green recovery. Now, if you could just, of course, your article is largely around air pollution. If you could just tell us a little, talk about, of course, how does this budget address the issue of air pollution and government's political will to address air pollution? Because we've seen that in the last 2 years, a few announcements. And also broadly, as in how green this current budget has been given the post-COVID times that we're living in. So air pollution in specific and overall sustainability in general.
Sure, I'll give that a try. So starting with air pollution, I think it's a mixed bag, right? So I think there are definitely a couple of major positives, but there are also fairly big lacunae as well. So on the positives, I think the most important thing is that these finance commission grants to urban agglomerations have been sustained. So just sort of as a quick background, last year, for the first time, this sort of finance commission grant to urban local bodies, but which were essentially performance-based grants, were announced for the first time. So a sum of 4,400 crores was allocated. And essentially the way this thing was going to work was that urban local bodies, municipal corporations and so on, in 42 cities with 1 million plus populations can avail of these grants, and they get it based on some function of how well they're doing in terms of air quality. There was like a rubric and so on to measure performance. That was recommended in the interim report of the 15th Finance Commission, which was for a single year. So one of the main things to watch out for in this budget was whether those grants were going to be sustained, because this is a substantial sum of money, right? And it is something that sort of mainstreams air quality and sort of embeds it into municipal governance. And so I think that's therefore very welcome. Ultimately, the urban local bodies have important roles to play with waste burning, with dust management, to some extent with transport also, in terms of the infrastructure. So it's very welcome. And so these have now been sustained. This year, 2,217 crores have been allocated, but these grants are also going to be allocated every year in the next 5 years, right? So this is sort of a predictable sum of money, which is explicitly tied to performance and air quality outcomes. So I'm very, very glad that they have been sustained. The amount has been
2,000 crores for around 40 plus towns.
Yeah, 42 cities. So
basically
the biggest
5 crores a year.
Sorry, 2,200 crores a year.
Yes, which makes it 5 crores a year per city, right? As maths is that?
It varies from 50 crores. It actually varies quite a bit from city to city. So this amount is allocated essentially on the basis of population. So the Mumbai urban agglomeration, for instance, gets about 250 crores for the year. Can get I mean there's still some sort of funda here about how much of that they'll get, and in case there are weak performers, how it will get redistributed among the others and so on. But
this is sort of the not pollution.
Sorry,
it is the population and not pollution.
It is based on population. So how these cities have been identified is partly on the basis, so it's urban agglomerations with more than 1 million plus population, which have a reasonable pollution problem. So there are, I think, 6 cities or 7 cities in Kerala that have a population of more than 1 million, but they are not eligible for these grants because it was deemed that they don't have enough of an air pollution problem. Likewise with Coimbatore. Sorry?
Have a different party government there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's mostly geography.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think this is definitely like a positive thing. On the negative side, though, the Finance Commission grants are only complementary to the National Clean Air Program, right? They're not synonymous with each other. This is a completely different funding channel. It is restricted to municipal corporations alone, and therefore can be utilized only for certain types of sources. Major sort of high priority measures on industries, on power plants, on vehicles even, cannot actually be funded by this particular source. So you're still dependent on NCAP. You're still dependent on NCAP also for 90 of the 124 non-attainment cities, right? So there's only like a incomplete sort of overlap here. So and there, there has been a very, very modest increase in the allocation. So NCAP funds come from a line item called control of pollution. Last year it was 460 crores. This year it is 470 crores. Last year itself, the MOEFCC had demanded 660 crores, and therefore there's an under allocation of 200 even by that admittedly modest sort of demand. So yeah, I mean, NCAP really, there's nothing much to write home about. And in fact, this year, under this particular line item, there is a huge underspend. Of the 460 crores that was part of the budget estimate for this year, for 2020-21, the revised estimate suggests that we can only spend about 280 crores or something on this. So first of all, it's a small sum of money. You're not even spending that. And yeah, so I think MOEFCC has a lot to explain in terms of why they're finding it so difficult.
And there's also been reduction in overall budget allocated to Ministry of Environment and Forest, right?
As I understand, it has come down. I need to double check. I think it has increased by a little bit, but the revised estimates are much lower.
Okay, because I read it somewhere that perhaps the overall budget allocation for Ministry of Environment and Forest has come down, and also several of these autonomous bodies that are under Ministry of Environment and Forest, their funding has actually been cut as well, as a lot of research organizations that are there, their funds have actually been restricted.
Yeah, see, I mean, at least in terms of total allocation, you're right. So the budget estimates for 2020-21 was 3,100 crores. This year, it is less than 2,900, 2,869. The revised estimates, though, I mean, sure, the allocation could have been 3,100 last year, but the revised estimate suggests that only 2,015 crores will actually be spent by MOEFCC this year. So it's one thing to sort of do an allocation. It's another thing to make sure that this is spent and spent well. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So my concluding question to you, given the new commission, given the budget that you rightly mentioned, that it has allocated a little more than what it is, or at least accepts the problem in that sense, and looking at going beyond Delhi, given all of this right now, is there a hope in 2021, 2022 of better air in Delhi NCR? Do you think this entire regime, the landscape vis-a-vis air pollution, is going to get better anyway?
So I think there is hope in that they'll continue to be sort of incrementally small steps forward. So I am, all said and done, still somewhat sort of optimistic about the commission. Leaving aside all the caveats as to we don't know anything about how it plans to function and so on, but I hope that they're going to get things together, because I think just as directionally, it seems like a useful thing. The Finance Commission grants and so on, for example, have no bearing on Delhi. Delhi is not a recipient of these grants. For Delhi and more generally, I think directionally we have sort of been doing the right types of things. We have not been doing it at the scale of urgency that we needed. We are not necessarily doing it at the scale of ambition that we needed. But directionally, I think we are doing okay. Will, for example, this year be any less polluted than the last year was? Last year was actually an outlier, right? Because of the lockdowns and so on. So it shouldn't be compared. But is it going to be markedly different? I wouldn't hold my breath. And I mean, something that I do wish that the governments were able to do was somehow communicate that, look, here is how we are going to track progress over the years. Is saal ke liye, sort of keep in mind that we are going to do X, Y, Z. Public transport ko itna augment karenge, and waste burning, we are going to try and reduce it like this and so forth. But also signal that significant sort of visible improvements in air quality will take some time. Right? So if they are realistic about it, but are also willing to be held accountable to it, I think that's sort of the direction that we would like to, we would want to take. And I mean, I think for us in sort of the research civil society space, one of the areas that I do wish all of us pay a little more attention to is moving from this demand for clean air, which I think, all sudden has got some political traction, you're getting some kind of increase in budgets and so forth, to more specific demands on how to get there, right? So here are our priorities. For buses, this is our target. And, so essentially, have a set of clear interventions, not just for Delhi, but also for other parts of the country that are important. Know clearly which agencies are responsible, where there is the need for like additional monetary resources or additional sort of human resources in terms of increasing the size of the pollution control board's staff or something like that. Like have fairly specific demands on all of these things. I do think that we sort of need to evolve a little bit on this front and be able to have sharper demands, especially when it comes to resources.
Absolutely right. So what you're saying is that we need to deconstruct that into actual specific agenda for each city. Like you rightly said that if it means 3,000 more buses, or it means no thermal power plants in 100-kilometer radius of Delhi NCR, or the better waste management of our landfills and everything else. As you rightly said, that every city will have to have a specific agenda and clear targets in that sense. But one thing in conclusion, breathing less is not a choice, right? We don't have an option that we will sell over in 2021 because air is bad, we'll breathe less. Or breathing bad air is something which is not again an aspirational new India virtue. As normal citizens and not as a researcher, as citizens, what are the options that citizens are left with right now to combat this current crisis? Other than one, of course, shifting out, as in people who can afford to can move to Goa or to the mountains. And a normal individual, both from breathing and making sure that air pollution doesn't affect them so much physically, and from building a narrative and contributing towards better pressure point. What's the roadmap? What's the prescription that you have for normal citizens to save themselves and also to fix the air by the government? This is a last question that I have for you.
Sure. It's a very difficult question because it's something that I often struggle with. Because on the one hand, we need to recognize that, especially when sort of governments ask for individuals to be more responsible, they're effectively sort of shifting the blame, right? Because that with issues like air pollution, generally with most environmental issues, there is only that much that an individual can do. And typically when you hear the government say it, essentially they're saying, "Hum nahi karenge, all of you first be more responsible, then we will see," right? That said, it's impossible to deny that all of us at an individual level can be more responsible in terms of various choices we make, right? In terms of our consumption more generally, but also in terms of the mode of transport that we use, whether we are actually sort of segregating waste ourselves, whether we are composting ourselves, whether we take advantage of, especially in a Delhi, whether we take advantage of forums that exist from CPCB and others to essentially complain about waste burning, complain about a particular construction site not adhering to the norms. And you have that forum available, right? I mean, so you can't claim to be both serious about this and at the same time not taking that additional very modest step of like raising a complaint when you can. So that's one thing. All said and done, ultimately, I do think that the role of individuals and communities is to sort of raise the pitch of the demand to our politicians. There is no getting around to air pollution becoming a politically salient issue for us to be able to make any kind of progress. So that means that we are able to identify like avenues where having a sort of a more focused demand is important. So let me give an example, right? I mentioned earlier about how household sources are the single largest contributor as a group. One of the most important steps in the recent past has been Ujjwala in providing access to millions, to 8 crore plus households apparently. But we also know that access alone won't really get very far. You need to make sure that LPG is affordable to people, to poor households to use it on a regular basis. This, I think, is like a very, very straightforward like political demand, right? That LPG subsidies be increased, be potentially targeted to poor households. And so then it's going to have improvements in public health outcomes in those households. It will reduce air pollution. It is politically phenomenally attractive, as the Modi government has already recognized. So I think uh, while we can be individually more responsible, I think ultimately it's still important that we are able to make this an issue that we care about politically and electorally. No getting around that.
Absolutely right. So, as you rightly said, that citizens can engine on, engine off at the traffic signals. Citizens can do odd, even, and many other things. But it's important for citizens to actually demand those questions of the government. So government can't just tell us to turn off our engine and they can go off to sleep. And that's how the regime will change. I think better governance, more money to be allocated, and timely short-term, medium-term, long-term action is what we actually need to change the way things are. Because if we have to believe the Lancet report and many other reports that we have, actually air pollution kills more number of people than anything else in our country or in our subcontinent in that sense. Thank you, Santosh, for this conversation, and hope to keep hearing you on television and keep reading your articles everywhere, and helping us understand air pollution with data and with policy. Thanks a lot once again.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a pleasure.